Welcome back to the Philly Film Room podcast. Along with Eric Sidewater, I'm Nick Waters. And now that we are past 4th of July weekend, training camp is right around the doorstep. So, having said that, we're jumping into the tight ends. And Eric, I don't know about you, but I think this is actually a underrated and pretty solid group considering the rest of the state of the NFL and their tight end rooms. I think this is a room that's going to surprise some people. So, I'll kick it over to you. What do you think are some of the strengths of this unit?
Yeah, well, we're lucky that we have Dallas Goddard, who is easily one of the best tight ends in the NFL. And just because of the nature of the Eagles' offense hurts his tendency to look towards the star receivers, I think, he had a little bit of a lower target share than he would have had he been on another team. So that kind of makes it so his impact isn't as great as his talent potentially suggests it could be. So Goddard to me is one of the most well-rounded tight ends in the entire NFL. He can block in line, even against edge rushers, whether he's chipping or at times straight up going head on head against them and holding his own in run blocking. He's really good blocking in space downfield. In terms of the pass game, he's very unique in the sense that he can attack the defense at all three levels. The Eagles, you especially, I think it was 2022, we saw it even more, where they were using him on these tight end screens a lot. And when he gets the ball, I mean, his ball carrier vision is amazing. Better than a lot of running backs I've seen. He follows his blocks extremely well. He doesn't outrun the blockers, runs to space away from defenders, fleet-footed, doesn't go down easily to arm tackles. In fact, I think Kyle Brandt has this series called Angry Runs, and Goddard has been on that multiple times. He plays with a mean streak, and he takes pride in that part of his game, and you need some of those tone setters on your offense. As we know, he's extremely good on intermediate routes. He has a really good understanding of spacing. Often tight ends, it's not like they're cooking guys in man coverage, just because you're a 6'5" guy who's close to 250, it's hard to create that much separation unless you're like Travis Kelce. So a lot of times it's working against zone coverage. So if you're like working over the middle of the field, often what you're told to do is find the midpoint between two of those like middle hook zone defenders. And he does a really good job where he'll kind of stay close to one guy and then give a little extra room so that the quarterback can lead him so that when he catches it, he's directly in between them and they have a really hard time making a play on the ball. Now, the unfortunate thing is that the Eagles didn't target the middle of the field, especially in the intermediate area, hardly at all compared to the rest of the NFL. I pray that they do that more next season. But as going outside, he's great too. Good, catching along the sideline. And he has some decent long speed, so he can stretch the field. I wouldn't necessarily put him in the George Kittle ranks for deep field stretching. But if you just have a linebacker who is caught on him in man, and he could definitely win deep. So those are a lot of, good facets of his game. Now, he broke his forearm in week 9 on his own stiff arm. It was kind of self-inflicted. And after that, I thought his production, it went down because he wasn't the same player after. And he mentioned that he was kind of rehabbing it even throughout the early offseason. And then just to talk about CJ Uzama real quick before I pass it over. Everyone knows why they brought him in. He's known to be a great blocker. I don't think they'll be using him on routes very often. But, he is a capable catcher of the ball. It's not like he has rock for hands. But yeah, he can bully guys at times. And Kellen Moore, we've seen, whether it was with the Chargers or with the Cowboys, he's using 2 and 3 tight end sets fairly often. I'm sure you have stats that show how he is relative to the rest of the NFL, so I'm curious to hear about those. But yeah, I think Uzama will get a good number of snaps, and for what he'll ask to be do, or for what he's asked to do, we already know for a fact that he's good at that. Uh, so yeah, what do you think of the strengths of this unit?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the strength is definitely Goddard. If we're talking about a player specifically, and you made a number of great points about him. Just some of the notes I wrote down, stuff that popped out when watching film. As far as his route running, he's very good using his size and his physicality at the top of the route to create separation. Uh, in terms of catching the ball, early in his career, he had a lot of concentration drops that were pretty frustrating. You'd see him make crazy acrobatic catches like it was nothing. But then, simple, hitch routes or over the ball routes, he would just take his eyes off the ball, trying to get upfield too quickly and have these bad concentration drops. He had his lowest, his best drop rate of his career this past season, and that's following a 2022 season that was his best at that point in time. You see him routinely catch the ball away from his body with soft hands. He catches it on the move and is able to get upfield quickly without breaking stride, and that includes passes that are behind him or above his head. And he showed really great awareness this past season to get his feet in bounds on some of these corner routes and out routes that he was running. So those are great to see. And you mentioned it, like he just doesn't get targeted as much as some of the other top tight ends in the league, and especially over the middle. But his size and his ability to make contested catches should really show up catching over the middle more often. But we just don't see him get targeted that over the middle that often. That's an area where not necessarily he can improve, but his opportunities should improve over time. I'd hope to see Jalen and Goddard have a little bit of a better connection going into next season. Now, I think part of the issue is Jalen just he AJ and Devontae are just so good that I can't blame him if he's targeting those guys more often. If Goddard was on another team, I think you'd be talking about him as one of these top 5 fantasy tight ends in the range of the maybe not the Kelsey, but the Kittle and the Mark Andrews range where these guys often get drafted at. So I think he's a little bit of a victim of circumstance. You mentioned his run after catch ability is fantastic, super physical. He's not running away from guys really, but he's just so hard to get down on the ground. Now, an issue with that though is we've seen him get injured throughout his career, and I think part of that has to do with just how physical he is as a runner. Sometimes those hits add up. Maybe there's some times where he could play it a little safer and get what you can, but let's save some hits, especially in a long season and for a team that's really looking to make a run at the Super Bowl. As a blocker, I think he's a really good blocker as well. He wins with foot quickness off the line, so he can win and reach blockers that have him out leveraged, whether he's trying to reach them on the front side of runs or if he's the cutoff blocker on the back side of zone runs. He's really good at that. He's great on combo blocks, working with the first level, working with his offensive linemen on the first level before tracking linebackers or safeties at the second level. And in fact, he had his third best run block grade. He had the third best run block grade of the top 50 tight ends and blocking snaps last season, and the fourth best pass block grade. So I think that just goes to show the type of all-around player that he is. But to jump into the strengths of the team, like you said, Uzoma is a really good blocker as well, especially in the run game. So I think they're going to pair well together. I think we're going to see a good amount of 12 personnel, just based with how this team is built. And I think Uzoma being a good end line blocker will help Goddard be able to flex out a little bit. And then in addition to that, I think this is overall a pretty solid group. When I start to look at who they have on the team and kind of how they've constructed it, they've got 2 good blockers and Goddard and Uzoma, and some teams don't even have one good blocking tight end. It's a very athletic unit too. If you look at Goddard, and especially Albert Okuwegbunam, I had to get that name out once. But Albert O is incredibly athletic player, and I think he was 256 pounds at the combine, 6'5", 256 pounds at the combine. He ran the same 40 as AJ Brown, And you can see it on tape. This guy he just moves differently than all the other athletes. He's more explosive than Goddard is. He's a guy that creates big plays when he is given opportunities. He just hasn't been given a ton of opportunities throughout his career. But when you look at his 2021 season, when he got his most targets, he was sixth in yards per route run amongst tight ends. That's nothing to overlook. So hopefully he can get used more in certain aspects with this team. Grant Calcaterra is a pretty solid athlete for the position as well. He's not the same as Goddard and Albert O, but he's not a slow-footed tight end. And again, Goddard, Uzoma, and Albert O are all about 255 or bigger. So they have size, they have athleticism, they have two good receiving tight ends, two good blocking tight ends. I think depth is, if Goddard were to go down, I think Albert O could step in and provide a lot of good play for you in certain aspects. And then Uzoma's still there to be your blocking tight end at that point in time. So I think when you look at the state of tight end rooms around the NFL, there's not a ton of 1-2 punches and the history of like when we had Goddard and Ertz. There's not a lot of rooms where you have two good tight ends like that. There's a few. We were talking about it before the show. The Ravens have a couple of good tight ends. Who are some of the other ones we talked about?
Oh, the Bills.
Bills with Kincaid and Dawson Knox. But there's plenty of tight end rooms that don't even have one good tight end. So when you got not only a stud tight end like Goddard and then good depth with a variety of skill sets behind it, I think it's a lot that goes into it. And when I look at the weaknesses, it's hard for me to really find any weaknesses. Eric, did you have anything that really kind of stands out to you in terms of weaknesses of the unit?
No, not really. I guess the only thing I would say is they really only have one well-rounded tight end, where Uzama is 90% blocker, 10% receiver, and Alberto's the exact opposite of that. But like you said, almost no teams have that. It's a total luxury. And in fact, I don't even know if you want that. Sometimes if you want your second and third tight ends to be specialists so that when they do get on the field, they can actually make an impact, as opposed to just be a random guy taking up space out there. Speaking of which, I kind of thought that was true of Jack Stoll at times. Everyone knew he was not a receiver, but he was billed to be a very good blocking tight end. I did not think personally that he was that great of a blocking tight end. I thought he was mediocre. And he got a bunch of snaps. I'm sure you have the count on that, but it was like, man, on any given play, you got 5 guys out there, and one of them as the potential eligible receiver is Jack Stoll, and then when you're running, he's not like a dominant blocker. At that point, I'd rather just sub in an extra offensive lineman. So I thought that was a little bit of a handicap. Whereas Uzama, I feel really good about his blocking. And Albert O, he's such like low on the depth chart. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I could envision a team not even really recognizing he's out there, and then they have a linebacker on him, and it's like, oh, holy crap, this guy runs a 4.5 and is just burning my linebacker down the field. Now, when the Eagles first got him, I envisioned this, and then he got like 15 snaps the entire year, and I think he had 1 target. So it might be one of these perennial frustration things where it's like, man, let's just try to get this guy more involved, and it never materializes. But I gotta say this: if our third best receiver turns out to be Paris Campbell, I wouldn't mind Alberto taking some of those snaps, because if you're Kellen Moore, sometimes he'll like to run these sets where he'll have like a bunch of tight ends on the outside, and then he'll like throw screens or something like this. You don't necessarily have to be a great blocking tight end in that scenario. If you're 6'5", 250, and you're getting your hands on a defensive back, as long as you don't whiff, you're making an impact. And I'd much rather have Alberto take on that role than Paris Campbell. But yeah, I'd probably have a third receiver out there more often in like, third downs. I hope that more employees, like you said, more 12 and even 13 personnel at times. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is predictions on how many tight ends will be active. I've heard from a lot of like podcasts and beat writers that they think it might only be two. And then the way the practice squad works, you can, for a couple weeks each year, like call a guy up. Um, and so you effectively can have three active tight ends. But it's of course it's going to depend on how the roster composition shakes out. But I could see them having three active tight ends for the entire year. No practice squad gimmicks or anything, because Kellen Moore runs those sets, and I think it gives a little more dynamism to the offense than just setting up in spread when your third receiver is Paris Campbell. So, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I want to jump back to Albert O just a little bit because he kind of got lost in the shuffle last year. I really don't know why he didn't play more outside of the whole. He really isn't a good inline blocker. You brought up him, blocking on screens and stuff like that. As a second level blocker, when he can get up to tight ends or safeties, I think he does a solid job. So if you ask him to play in space, I think he can do that. Or to work up to the second level, I think he can do that as a blocker. And also, you mentioned who's our receiver three. Do we have one that's going to be some guy that you just have to keep getting on the field? I don't think so. So why not do things like come out in 12 and 13 personnel and come out in empty sets? A lot of times what's going to happen is you're going to force a defense to come out in heavy personnel and their base personnel as well. And then you can get matchups, isolations with the guys that you really want to target, whether that is AJ or Devontae or even Saquon in some facets, or if it is Alberto in a good matchup. As a route runner, going back and looking at it, I didn't pay that much attention to him last year because he got one target, but he was open a lot. The ball just didn't find him for whatever reasons. I think that's a conversation for a different time. But when I looked at him as a route runner, I thought he was pretty damn good. He does a good job of stemming to create leverage advantages, and then he also will use head fakes and rocker steps at the top of the route to create separation as well. He's also physical at the top of the route to create separation. He's probably about the same size as Goddard, weight-wise. So he can be very physical and quick out of his breaks. And he's also excellent after the catch. So even if you get him some, like, tight end dump off screens, like we've seen that were given to Goddard throughout his career, he's a hard guy to bring down. He runs hard. He runs physical. He's got some wiggle. When you go back and look at his Broncos tape, there were several plays where he hurdled guys, not just hurdled and fell over, like hurdled, landed, and instantly started running. There's a very explosive element to this guy. They need to figure out a way to get him on the field. He is a weapon. Now, I will say his hands could use some work. He does fight the ball a little bit. His catch rate, his drop rate hasn't been terrible throughout his career for the most part, but you'll see a good amount of times where he's double catching. So maybe he's a guy that we don't throw out on third down a ton because, a drop on third down hurts you way more than it does on first and second down. But I think we overrate drops to a degree, especially if you're a player that can create explosive plays. You live with that. You look at some of the best receivers in the league, a lot of times they have high drop rates, but they create explosive plays that moves their offense down the field that you live with that kind of stuff. I think Albert O is a similar type of player. I really hope that they can figure out a way to get him on the field. Now,
Real
in
quick,
terms of like, oh, go ahead.
yeah, real quick. I don't know if anyone has seen this show on Netflix called Physical 100, but they basically do a series of physical events that stress speed, endurance, and all different facets of athleticism to try to find the best physique. If the NFL was just set up like this, Okuwebunam might win the whole thing. Because as for his size, the way he moves, it's literally unbelievable. I think you mentioned he's a little unrefined in certain areas of the game, but it's like if you can just get him the ball, yeah, he's definitely a weapon. So thought I'd
Yeah,
mention
and
that.
and he's yeah, definitely. I mean, he's just a different type of athlete out there. And if you look at the best tight ends in the NFL, they generally are just different type of athletes. The guys that when your fantasy leagues are guys that are they hit a certain threshold in terms of their athleticism, and he definitely hits that. Just hopefully the rest of his game can round out, or they can figure out how to use them in specific ways. But I'll add to this as well. Kellen Moore does come out and um, some interesting formations. He's creative. If you check the Dallas tape, they would go and run. They lined up like it was 22 personnel, so two tight ends and a fullback and a running back in an I formation. Really, they had three tight ends out there, and one of their tight ends was a fullback. I wouldn't be surprised to see Alberto in that position, knowing that he's better as a second level blocker than taking on defensive linemen. And you have two good inline blockers in Goddard and Uzoma. And then you can also run plays where you're running play action and then you're slipping him out in the flat from that fullback position. You get him underneath with a lot of space to work. Those are easy yards for him to pick up. Much better than someone like if you were to stick Uzoma at fullback or even Grant Calcaterra at fullback, who's by no means a bad athlete, but he's just not the same type of player as Alberto. So I'd be interested to see that. There's other plays. If you look at the Chargers, especially towards the end of the year last year, they had to get pretty funky with some of their formations and what they're doing because they just watching that offense with Easton Stick and and whoever they had on offense, Alec Erickson at receiver, Quentin Johnston, Stone Smart was their tight end. It got bad at the end of the year, but they had to get creative. You'd see them line up in a lot of full house formations out of pistol. So Kellen Moore will get creative with the players that he has, just to give offenses different looks. They're not going to base out of those looks, but it's a different way to run your base plays. Just presenting it in a different way to the defense. So, but in terms of I think they're going to be three tight ends active every week because Kellen Moore is going to use three tight ends in his offense. He didn't do it at a super high rate last year, but there were some teams that really never used three tight ends in their offense. Kellen Moore is not that type of player. He's always been top fifth. I think in 4 of his 5 seasons, his offenses have been top 15 and use of 12 personnel. So they do use multiple tight end sets. So we'll see. But in terms of who you think gets the most snaps as a tight end too, I'm guessing you're leaning Uzoma.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Just because of the blocking, if they're running from under center, they're not going to have Alberto out there. So and just probably if you strip first down out of it, maybe they would be evenly split, and then I'll say 95% of the first down snaps would go to Uzama between him and Alberto.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think Uzoma came in to fit a very specific role. It allows them to split Goddard out if they want to put him in the slot or potentially out wide to kind of create a situation where you get a tell on the defense if a linebacker or safety follows him out to the number one, or is it a corner sitting out there, so you can kind of get those looks. But also, like if you want to go into your 6 and 7 man protections where you have your tight end staying in the block, I think Uzoma allows you to do that confidently while also being able to get Goddard out in a route. On especially with how this team's built at wide receiver 3, I think it's going to be a mix and match type scenario of who's out there, whether that's Paris Campbell or running in the slot or Anais Smith running in the slot, and then maybe when they want to move AJ or Devontae into the slot, have Johnny Wilson outside, and then also do they have Goddard in the slot or split out? So I think Uzoma helps give you that flexibility to do that. So I agree with you. I think he will get the second most snaps at tight end, and I don't think it's particularly close, barring any injury to Goddard. Now, did you notice anything on film of how Kellen Moore liked to use his tight ends? Anything that stuck out?
Yeah, well, the first thing, and we've already talked about this, is that he'll have a bunch of them out there at the same time. I think more often than not, and you can fact check me on this, it was unbalanced formations where they'll stick them next to each other as opposed to like a symmetrical formation where the tight ends are on either side. And I think that's just more difficult to defend for the defense. Um, I noticed that he really likes to target them in the red zone. I'd be curious to see if the statistics support that. But I saw random tight ends like Donald Parham getting a good share of targets in the low red zone. Um, One of the things that we'll talk about more in the future is like even in some short yardage situations, Kellen Moore can be pass happy. Not necessarily a terrible thing, just depending on the concepts you have. Um, but it could juice up the touchdown numbers for Goddard. I probably think he would be the main beneficiary of that. Now, if you use that same logic, because Gerald Everett was the best tight end on the Chargers, maybe Uzama gets 2 or 3 touchdowns. So for any of those in like a 20 team fantasy league that where you're going reaching deep into the barrel, then maybe you draft CJ. Um, those were the kind of things that stuck out to me. How about for you?
Yeah, so I'll touch on the red zone stuff. I didn't. I really should have gone and looked at low red zone when I was putting these numbers together. But I just because when you watch on film, they got a lot of targets to their tight ends in the low red zone, where a lot of their touchdowns came on the low red zone to their tight ends, and a lot of it came because of they would run like these check release routes to the flat off of play action, and you'd see these guys just be wide ass open and walk in for easy touchdowns. Um, Looking at Schultz, Dalton Schultz is I think he's the best comparison to look at for when you look at back at Kellen Moore's time as a coordinator, just how the Dallas offense was built, especially in 2021, compared to what the Eagles offense is. He had 8 touchdowns in 2021. He had 5 in 2022. And Goddard had 3 touchdowns, I think, this past year. He just didn't get targeted in the red zone that often. And one of those touchdowns came off of like a scramble drill where he definitely wasn't the first option. Kellen Moore uses play action and he uses his tight ends much more in the red zone area. And over the past 2 years, last year in 2023, they were eighth in percentage of targets that went to the tight end in the red zone. They were ninth in 2022. Now they were 21st, and 23rd in the years before then. So there has been a change, but that's why I like to look. I should have split it out to the low red zone area because targets in the high red zone area just are not nearly as uh, important as a low red zone area. In terms of, but here, like you said, in terms of total targets, this is what's more important. They were sixth, ninth, and 10th over the past 3 years in terms of how many total targets to tight ends in the red zone. Kellen Moore, like you said, he just typically passes more. So if they are going to pass more in the red zone, I think we're going to see Goddard get more action and more targets on the red zone. I think he should get more touchdowns that way. Um, in terms of like routes that they're going to run and stuff like that, I think everyone wants us to turn Goddard into Kittle, where he's running a ton of crossing routes and a ton of dig routes over the middle. That's not really how Kellen Moore has used his tight ends for the most part. They'll use them on a lot of seam routes, especially on like four verts plays. But the problem is when you run four verts, a lot of times what's happening is those, especially last year when the Eagles would run it, because that was also a staple concept of theirs, the outside routes would convert to curls if the corners were playing off coverage. So those end up being targets that just go to either AJ or Devontae. And there was times where Goddard's running open on seam routes, but Jalen just isn't wanting to take those throws. Those are often tighter throws, but they're higher reward plays, a little bit higher risk, but they're higher reward plays if you do hit that seam route. But it is safer to just get it out to AJ and Devontae on those curl routes. And also, they're just, I mean, they're top. AJ's a top 5 receiver. Devontae's in that top 10 to 15 range. I can't blame Jalen for targeting them on those routes, but you're going to see a lot of where they get their targets a lot. The tight ends in this offense are a lot on over the ball, like sit routes, curl routes, hitch routes, spot routes on quick passing concepts, flat routes like check and release, or plays where they're just designed to get to the flat right away. So I don't think I think AJ and Devontae are gonna get targeted more on in breaking routes than I think Goddard is. So just a warning there. We'll see how it ends up though.
And tight end screens. They did run a decent number of those.
Yeah, and that's always been a thing that we've done with Goddard too. So I hope that stays in. One thing I do hope stays in is the play. Perfect example of this play was a play where Goddard broke his arm against the Cowboys. Um, but it's kind of like this read option RPO play where Goddard's coming in. They pair it off of their split zone action where Goddard's looking like he's coming to block, sift block across the formation, and then he just leaks out to the flat. And oftentimes you have the number one receiver on that side is kind of running a rub route to make sure he does get open, but that would get Goddard wide open on a bunch of plays and get a lot of explosives out of that. Low risk and high reward is how I'd categorize that play. I hope that's carries over into this offense because it was one of the best concepts that the Eagles ran. So I hope that does stay the same.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, unless the defense is literally having a corner just sit in the flat right there, it's very hard to defend that. Otherwise they're gonna have a guy like chasing him across the line of scrimmage where it's gonna be very hard to tackle him at that point. So I totally agree with you. I'm sure you'll show a clip of that play. These plays are awesome. They're some of my favorites, so I hope we run them.
Yeah, and also if teams do start to show that, then what they would do is they would have that number one receiver come in like he's gonna run that rub route, but then run a curl route behind it. We've gotten a couple touchdowns at least off of that in the past, and some big plays that come off of it. So there are adjustments to make sure that you're still able to run that play, but that's one that I just definitely hope carries over. Now, in terms of looking at, we've done this with every position group so far, looking at players that could potentially get added if the team wanted to add to the unit. I don't think this is a unit that you need to go out there and add someone to, but I do have my eye on Greg Dulcich, how that situation's working out in Denver. If you look at what Sean Payton is doing, he's pretty much talking shit indirectly to Dulcich. He got injured last year, and he's pretty much been MIA. Hasn't been involved much in OTAs. I think he was still rehabbing. And Sean Payton's really been hyping up one of their backup tight ends, talking about how you need to get this guy on your fantasy team and whatnot. And he's a player that you need to get to know. So I forgot who the guy's name was. But what I took away from it is he seems unhappy with Dulcich. That's a guy that I would take a risk on. He's a young tight end. He's an athletic tight end, good receiving tight end with some upside. And as we start to look at the long-term view of the unit, adding some young pieces isn't something that the Eagles should shy away from at this position group. So anyone in mind for you in terms of additions?
Oh no. I hardly recognized a single name on the available free agents. I would have potentially been interested in Ertz, but now he's went to the Commanders, which kind of pisses me off. I don't know how much he has left in the tank, but yeah, I'm happy with the group. I don't think they need to add to it. Goddard commented, and he's like, "I think my best years are ahead of me." Now that may just be lip service. Every single player says their best years are ahead of them, unless they're like on the retirement tour. But I think he's got at least 3 great years left in him. So maybe in a year or two they invest a little bit more draft capital in a tight end. So, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, there was one guy I was really looking at in free agency was Jonnu Smith, who went to the Dolphins. They also got Calais Campbell. For anyone who watches this podcast, I was waxing poetic about Campbell, so the Dolphins are on my shit list right now. He's an unbelievable yards after catch player, but yeah, I think that it's a solid group. You just gotta hope they stay healthy.
Yeah, like you said, I just don't think we need to add anyone else to this unit. I think they're pretty set. But there was one other guy I noticed so he was getting a little bit of buzz online from some people right after the draft. Undrafted free agent tight end McAllen Castles out of Tennessee. I personally don't think he's going to make the team. I think he's a nice stash to develop. He's got a little bit of athleticism. He is a guy that I do think can be one of your blocking, play that fullback role if you want him to. That's kind of how he was used as a tight end and at Tennessee, where they didn't really have him lined up attached to the line of scrimmage. He would line up a lot more like behind the offensive line, even if not necessarily in a fullback position, but he did a lot of like lead blocking and kick out blocks from that position. If injuries took their toll, I think he would come in and fill a role like that. But he's got a little bit of he's got something to him where he can line up similar to Calcaterra. He can line up out wide. He can work in space. I think he can stretch the seam a little bit, but I think he does need a little bit of polish. So I just wanted to touch on him just a bit. Because I know some people were interested in him. Now, in terms of the long term view of the unit, man, I looked. I don't know if you looked at Goddard's contract on Spot Rack or Over the Cap. I had to do some deep digging to kind of figure this out. I really had to write this down on how his contract works out because it's a little confusing, but it's important to understand because usually on the last deal, Goddard signed through 2025, and usually how Howie has the contracts aligned, they're able to get out of those contracts the last year of those deals because they kind of backload them with money where they can kind of cut the guy and save some cap space. But he had a $14 million base salary in 2024 and 2025. I didn't see anything online saying that they converted that base salary to a signing bonus, which would then make that money guaranteed, as opposed to a base salary is usually non-guaranteed. So it looks like they have him committed through 2025. This is the thing. I think he's even coming back after 2026 because if they did convert his base salary to a signing bonus, if they get rid of him, if they don't bring him back after 2025, the Eagles are going to have $23 million in dead cap in 2026. And even if you did cut him in 2025 and did like a June 1st cut, he would have an $8 million cap hit in 2025, but still would be owed $23 million in 2026. It looks like they pretty much said, we're sticking with Goddard. And then on top of that, in order to flatten out that money, if you re-sign him, then you can flatten out all that money again, so it's not a huge hit against your cap. I would be interested. Sometimes these websites have these contracts wrong, but we'll have to see how that works out. It looks like he's a guy that's going to be here past 2025, in my opinion, unless some sort of major injury happens, but which I hope to God it doesn't. So I think he will be here long term. Grant Calcaterra is also signed through 2025. That's not preventing me from bringing in someone else. But if Albert O can, Uzoma is only signed through through this season, 1 year contract. I think he's 31. He's not a guy that I think they're going to bring back after that. We'll see. But if Albert O does show out, he's like 26 years old. If he shows he has some value, that's a guy that I'm wanting to bring back just because he brings a different element than most tight ends can. But if not, if they decide not to bring him back, I would look at the draft to see if they could grab someone, if someone is available or potentially free agency next year. But it's not necessarily a position where I'm saying, hey, we got to go out and find someone, especially seeing as they're probably going to need to fill needs at defensive end and linebacker, at least going into next season.
Yeah. So I heard that Goddard goes to that tight end university, and he said he talked to Greg Olson, who's like, my best years were age 30 to 32. And Goddard hasn't even hit that. So that maybe is why he came out and said, I feel like my best years are ahead of him. And I don't think it was lip service. I actually believe it. One of the beat writers, McMullen, he came straight out and said Goddard will get an extension. So, and he's not a guy who just says stuff without any sourcing. And he was very matter of fact about it. So I feel good about his future. One thing you did mention in the draft, I don't know if you've seen this guy from Michigan, Loveland. I mean, this guy is nasty. Because the other than Bowers, there was pretty much nobody right in this draft. Um, so I'm looking forward to seeing how it shakes out next year because I think it would be appropriate, maybe in like the top 3 rounds to address that because we talked about it in previous podcasts. A lot of the team for the next like 2 years, it's kind of sorted out. Like we know who the big players are going to be. So those little more niche positions, you can start to invest a little more resources in them. So yeah, I think I'm interested to see how that shakes out.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of people compare the Goddard situation to the Ertz situation because they were around the same age. Ertz was around this age when they went out and drafted Goddard. But here's the thing: Goddard was a better athlete than Ertz was. I love Ertz, and he's a very good technician. He's very good at what he did, but he just wasn't as good of an athlete. And I think that when you're not as good of an athlete, it's usually you start to lose steps a little quicker. I think Goddard was a better athlete, a better overall, well-rounded player than Ertz. Or I think Ertz was a better route runner. I think he was a little more nuanced and finding the soft spots and zones in Goddard. Not to say Goddard's bad at that, but that's really where Ertz excelled. He kind of became a little bit of a late career Jason Witten towards the end of Ertz's tenure with the Eagles, where he would catch the ball and then get no yak. And it was like, all right, do you need to pay a guy a ton of money if he's not creating that many explosive plays? Especially if you got a guy like Goddard waiting in the wings. We don't have a guy like Goddard waiting in the wings, and I don't think he's a guy. I think he's a guy that's going to continue to play well, like you mentioned. I think he'll be 30. What's he? 28 this year, 29 when this contract is
29.
up. So I think 30 when his new contract will kick in. That especially for tight ends, that's not that old. You start to look at guys like, I mean, Kelsey is still the best tight end in the league, and he's 34, close to 35 now. You see these guys. Ertz is still making plays as well, and he's still kicking around the league. But you see guys that are able to still play well at the position later in their career because tight end is a position where you have to be so well rounded. You have to do a lot of things. It's not like playing corner where it's like you need to be an incredible athlete to play long into your career. You can do a lot of different things to extend your career and still be a good player at tight end. It's just one of those positions like that. So I think Goddard is going to age pretty well. We'll have to see how that works out. But I think when people compare it to the Ertz situation, I think it's just different. I don't think we need to go out there and we have to find someone. It'd be nice to find, another guy to pair with them, but I don't think we should be kicking this guy out the door.
Yeah, I totally agree. One thing, kind of switching gears here a little bit, I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, was everyone knows the Eagles struggled mightily with these cover zero blitzes last year. Before the playoff game, they actually interviewed Goddard and they talked explicitly about this. And he said it about 7 times in the interview that he goes, you really want to punish these teams with the big play. Because once you hit them over the top once, they stop blitzing. The problem is the Eagles never hit them over the top. A lot of teams, what they do is, they'd bring 6 or 7 rushers, but they wouldn't necessarily press. They'd have their cornerbacks off a little bit. And it's like if you're saying, okay, every single time we know we're getting cover zero, I'm going deep to AJ or a slot fade to Quez, and the teams are predicting that. Doesn't matter if you have a mismatch; it still can be defended. So I think that Moore will build in more quick hitters, and Goddard will be a part of that plan. I mean, one of the things is a sight adjustment where if the guy who's guarding you blitzes, you just turn around and they throw it to you. So you're basically like shaving your route off prematurely and turning around. Somehow the Eagles didn't do that last year. It took 7 weeks for them to draw up a slot fade to Quez and a 3-yard out route to Goddard. So I think the tight ends will be uh, play a part in mitigating some of these problems with the blitz. The other part is max protect. The Eagles didn't really opt to max protect against 6 and 7 rushers. You can actually pick these blitzes up sometimes, especially if you have a mobile quarterback who can make a free one. If there's one free man, he can make a miss. Especially because we think Hurts is going to be healthier this year. If you have Uzama and Goddard and they stay in with Barkley, and then you just have like a 2 or 3 man route concept, that could be effective too. So just curious to hear if you had any thoughts on that specifically.
Yeah, that you when you're playing teams that, especially teams that are good at running max pressures, whether it's cover zero or what the Vikings were doing with, really they were doing stuff that teams don't do that often in the NFL with their with their hot pressures, where they're bringing six and playing five in zone coverage behind it. It kind of looks like cover zero where you're manning up everyone, but they're playing more of a zone based system. You see that a lot more in college than you do in the NFL. Point is, there's different ways to run cover zero. You need to have multiple different answers. Do need to have plays where you can beat people down the field. We saw the Eagles. One of the best throws of the season was a Mahomes play, throwing a corner route when the Eagles ran cover zero. It was a perfectly placed ball. I'll throw that clip up. Uh, we also saw a play from the Rams where the Ravens blitzed them, a zero blitz, and they ran a corner route with Cooper Kupp. Uh, Matt Stafford anticipated, knew he had to get the ball out and throw it with some loft and some touch, and throw on time so his receiver could go and run under it. There's times where you do need to push the ball down the field against cover zero. You can't just always rely on throwing quick passes because there's ways to run cover zero where you kind of take away those quick passes where uh, the Patriots did this a lot. Brian Flores did this a lot in Miami. It was pretty much like a read cover zero where you're reading the slide of the offensive lineman. If the offensive lineman slides to you, then the two interior rushers would often drop back into coverage, and you're wasting those offensive linemen, and they're dropping into the spots where those slant routes would be. So you can't always just rely on, hey, a slant route's going to be open over the middle because it's cover zero. You have to have different options and different things. The Eagles just didn't have, of all the issues that the Eagles offense had, I thought their biggest one by far was their ability to handle uh, big pressures. So when their teams brought 6 or 7 blitzers, hopefully that can change with more. But you need to have a nuanced game plan. It can't just be like, okay, we're going to run slot fades or 4 verts every single time, or we're just going to run quick hitters every time. You got to be unique with that. And then also using different types of motions to give yourself a leverage or to kind of, especially like with the way that Brian Flores would run his cover zero blitzes, anyone that stayed in to block, that person that was covering them was coming. So no matter what, they would always have one more blitzer than you had a blocker. Um, but you have to be a little bit creative. Like what you could do is you could run like a sift motion where it looks like split zone. Then your tight end's coming across on the other side of the formation. It looks like he's going to block, but then he leaks out into the flat. A lot of times that can work against those type of max pressures. There's a bunch of different ways that you can, handle those type of looks, but the Eagles just need to get more nuanced. They can't just rely on doing one or two things, or they're going to get eaten up again, no matter what they do. So that's something remains to be seen on how that they handle that. It's hard to say. I hate this saying. It can only get better because in professional sports, it can always get worse. If you and I went out there to play linebacker for the Eagles last year, guess what? They would have gotten worse. Um, but I feel like it's gonna be hard for them to get worse against cover zero than they were last year. So hopefully that's an improvement. And if it's not, it's gonna be the death of this team. So we'll see how that handles out. But
Well, I've heard one thing on that. I've heard from a beat reporter that one of the areas of focus in the interviews was plans against pressure, and we could only speculate that Moore did really good in answering those questions. Um, he was the top guy on the market. So, and if you look back, especially like at his Cowboys tape, I thought they had good answers to pressure. They would get Lamb in the slot and with when he can go either direction. I mean, he was almost unguardable. So, and the Eagles have players who can offer that as well. So, I'm not worried about it. But like you said, it was so bad last year that it should still be an area where it's like, okay, let's at least prove that we can beat it.
Yeah, and just for a little bit of hope, go back and look at Lamar Jackson when he played the Ravens in 2000. Excuse me, not play the Ravens when they played the Dolphins in 2021. No, 2022. No, 2021. The Dolphins just ran the same cover zero blitz. They ran it like 25 times in that game, and they destroyed the Ravens offense. And then the next year, the Ravens come out, and I think it was week 2 or something like that, and they put up 30 or 40 points against that same defense. He really made them pay. When you have a whole offseason to really focus in and figure out answers for that, you should come out better and have a better plan and be better prepared for it. So I think they'll be better. I think, especially with how Jalen is, some of the issues do fall on Jalen. Um, Everyone likes to say it was all coaching. Coaching had a lot of, and the play calls did have a lot to do with it. Some of it was on Jalen, just getting happy feet, wanting to scramble a little bit, not trusting the plays that were there to be made. Um, so hopefully, all together as a unit, they can all come together and just be a little bit better with that. But that is all for us this week. We'll be back next week as we continue our march towards training camp. The light is at the end of the tunnel. We are almost there, and I cannot wait. So make sure to like, subscribe, tell your friends so we can keep growing this podcast. And until next time, go Birds.